Alrighty. Are we started, guys? Are we live?
Mhm.
I am Andre Bailey. Hello, Chamber leaders from around America. I'm Andre Bailey. This is my friend Jacob Stewart.
Hello,
and
Andre, and hello, friends.
we're excited to have you on the webinar. We know a bunch of people are joining right now, 1 o'clock, so we'll kind of give a casual, soft opening, Jacob, to give those that are joining a chance to log on. But thank you for joining our webinar. Our organization, Jacob, we were Lead Homelessness. Now we're Rethinking Homelessness. That's the name of our organization. And this is a webinar, Jacob, exclusively for chamber leaders, chamber presidents, board members, on interesting topic how business leaders can solve panhandling and homelessness, a topic you're very familiar with, as we'll hear about in a second, as a 35-year chamber president. But so this session starts at 1 o'clock. We're going to go for 55 minutes, no longer, and so we're excited to have you here. Just a couple of topics that we're going to discuss. Number one, how business leaders can impact the growing problem of panhandling in a community. Business leaders, a lot of you work in downtown corridors, you work in cities where you're seeing this growing challenge of panhandling. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how homelessness, law enforcement, and the business community have to kind of weigh in on the new vernacular of public space management. You got to be involved in that, business leaders. And just modern ways business leaders can push their community to find best practices on homelessness. One of the things, Jacob, we learned together in our previous times working on homelessness was that there were things that were working around America and things that weren't working. So we're going to talk about those as well. But it's my pleasure, chamber leaders out there who are logging on to this webinar, to introduce Jacob Stewart, Senior President of Stewart and former President and Head of the Orlando Chamber of Commerce, the Central Florida Partnership, 35 years. He was tenured there and led what many people would say is led a very successful business engagement on homelessness from 2013 to 2017. So Jacob, welcome.
Okay. All right, those are your words, leading. We were a part of a team, and as chamber professionals know that this only works by engaging faithfully our volunteer leaders. And so I'm excited to talk about that, and I've looked at the list of who's joining us, and I'm familiar with many of the names and almost all the communities, so welcome.
Welcome. So we'll dive right in, and one thing to remember is you guys know me, I'm Andre Bailey, and I'm the founder of Rethinking Homelessness and have done this work on homelessness and anti-poverty programs, the opioid crisis, for the better part of 2 decades. Jacob, I'd say my maybe unique work is that I engage business leaders, faith leaders, and courageous politicians.
And I might say that the faith leaders are very important to this effort because our research reveals that the authorizing environment, the customer, the citizen really wants to know where the faith leaders are. And you being a minister in a previous life does help us with the dialogue and really the authentic way that you've approached these opportunities to serve.
Wonderful. And so remember, if you have we have a slide here. If you have questions that you want to ask during the webinar, you can go to the chat box. Madison will say, go to the chat box and ask your question. We'll try to answer as many of those questions live on the webinar as we can. Or you can email us at info@rethinkinghomelessness.org. We've already got some questions, but if you have questions, we'd love to answer them. So Jacob, I think the big idea here, if there's a big idea here, it's that homelessness is an issue being worked on around America, but that homelessness is really at a crossroads. As someone who has worked in communities for the past, the better part of 3-4 decades, homelessness has had many ways that our society has looked at it. But just in the past couple of years, I think homelessness has come back to the surface as a top-end community issue. And homelessness seems to be at a crossroads because many communities have seen some progress. Most communities, Jacob, have had some kind of effort to end homelessness.
Right.
But I think, and I think most who are on this webinar, business leaders, I think you'll indulge me with this, that most communities feel like they're still struggling to find solutions. And Jacob, here is, and some of our friends who are on this webinar, these are your cities. But some, Jacob, are struggling. Most communities in America are struggling with homelessness, maybe in a more profound way than they've ever seen previously. More homeless people in some communities, even despite all the money spent. So people are wrestling with this,
Yeah,
Jacob.
I mean, I think you're kind of stating the obvious to these leaders joining us today that we're spending lots and lots of money, and homelessness and chronic homeless particularly, is on the upswing. And it really is interfering with both the brand of communities, but also the core values of our communities. I don't think any of us wants to live in a community or in an area of our great country where we ignore the needs of others. And so that it's all kind of coming together, like you're saying, in a perfect storm. We have a widening wage gap that we know about. We have a widening achievement gap. And that's a data point that's playing into this homelessness situation. So we're going to talk about homelessness, but really focusing, if you don't mind, right, on chronic homelessness. And that's important for us now to learn the definitions of how we talk about this dilemma facing not one community or one state, but communities all across America.
Yep. So there's three things we're going to focus on today, and we're going to send you this PowerPoint after the webinar. So don't worry about taking pictures of all these slides. We'll send them to you. Three things, Jacob, we're going to talk about in the next 50 minutes. Number one, that business leaders need to focus on getting educated at some level about homelessness and panhandling. It's often business leaders. You feel for them. I feel for them.
I feel for them.
They're in charge of running companies, economic development, the revitalizing a downtown, if you will. But then homelessness, which is an issue that in theory they shouldn't have to deal with, often winds up at their doorstep, quite literally. So, but it's easy to try to push this conversation off on others. But in this community, I think what really made a big difference, Jacob, you ran the business community in partnership with others for a lot of years in Orlando, Florida. Right. But it was when the business community began to get educated, they were able to be more effective.
Yeah, listen, there's so many myths surrounding this dilemma for our communities. And I suffered from those myths, you'll remember. By you and your leadership, by driving research, it closed the gap of involvement. Business leaders, once given the facts and figures, the cost of homelessness, leaned in and really became engaged. And so, Andre, I think some of this information is transferable to other communities, but communities, it's normal now for business leaders to do research, to do market research and attitudinal research about how we see this and who's responsible for what we are called here in Central Florida, our neighbors in need. All right?
So Jacob, let's take them through a few things they should know that are very important. Number one, making sure business leaders, some of you might already know this, but making sure business leaders understand the types of homelessness. We've got, when you look at any group on your streets of your community, you're going to have people who are homeless for different reasons, and they're going to have different remedies to their homelessness. You've got people who are veterans. You've got folks that what we call family homelessness. Jacob was talking about the wage gap, poverty. These are folks that wind up on your streets. You have an incredibly important, if not the most important group of those who are homeless to the business community, chronic homelessness. Folks who are homeless for multiple years usually and are homeless because of a disabling condition. And then youth and other categories of homelessness. But understanding chronic homelessness might be one of the most important aspects of your leadership as a business leader on homelessness. Jacob, what was it about chronic homelessness as a business leader? There's all these folks on the street. We care about all of them. What about chronic homelessness stood out to you when you learned about it?
It was kind of just to dispel the myths. I think we grew up, or I grew up, in a faith-based family where we said, look, if you just work hard, if we can give you a chance to move up the ladder, so to speak, of economic prosperity, you need to grab hold. But what the research revealed is that chronic homelessness, not episodic and not family, but chronic homelessness, some of these people have been on the streets for 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, and they have disabilities that's going to make it just about impossible to come into the mainstream. And so now all of a sudden you have to approach that situation very differently than you do some of these other ways that we described homelessness. So we began to drive this vocabulary. Chronic homelessness is where we've had the greatest success And I think that's true for some of the other communities that you've worked in, Andre.
Absolutely. Let me skip to show you a slide, Jacob. You remember this slide well. Jacob had a footprint of 7 counties, I believe.
Right.
But a large amount of his stakeholders were in 3 counties: Osceola, Orange, Seminole, in Florida. This is kind of the I-4 corridor, if you will. Probably 80% of your business customers were here.
I think so.
So what we saw is this phenomenon of chronic homelessness, where you had people who were on the streets, they were in a shelter, but that didn't solve their problem. Then they were back on the streets and in jail. Then they were in an emergency room. Then they went to a behavioral health center. And Jacob, we saw this cycle play out over and over again. And when the business community learned about those who were chronically homeless, and Jacob, I think I have a chance to talk to leaders around America. I like to say it this way. When business leaders learned that there was a difference between, everyone gets our compassion, but some people didn't have the ability logically to ever be self-sufficient, to get themselves into housing. So they could die on the streets, or we could help them. I think that revelation that these folks who had chronic homelessness because of disabilities, who were out there the longest, sometimes panhandling the most, I think that was a public policy change when we learned about that.
Yeah, and I think when we began to talk to the people who were homeless, and not to assume, but to talk to them, people on the streets began to say, look, it's hard to have wraparound services. It's hard to stay on my meds. It's hard to go into therapy when I'm sleeping under the interstate highway, all right? And hey, by the way, Jake, I've been sleeping there for years. And so in the absence of a home, a place of security, it is exceedingly difficult. Think of yourselves now. If you lived on the street without any possessions, it is very difficult. So what do we do? How do we engage? And what we found out, we had to have an expert. It happened to be Andre Bailey. But the business people really began to lean in now and say, okay, we've got to fix this. And by the way, we haven't mentioned this yet, but it's true, some of the cities listed. We in Orlando have 75 million visitors a year.
That's the most of anyone.
The most in America. Now here we go. I don't want to get in an argument with some of the folks on the session, but we have a lot. Let's just put it that way. We have a lot, and that becomes now very, very important. How our visitors see how we deal with homelessness across our family of communities. And by the way, national media is in this. You mentioned youth homelessness. Today, front page story in the New York Times is how are children in the school system in New York City who are homeless, how do we deal with them? And it's in your city, it's in my city, it's in every city in this country.
I think, Jacob, it was a tipping point for us, even though it wasn't talked about publicly, that we couldn't be we couldn't be the #1 tourism destination in America and #1 in homelessness.
Yeah.
That although we didn't put that out in the media, there was this tipping point that I think was very real. And I think some of the business leaders out there, you're at the same place where you can't have tent cities and draw in visitors. It's hurting your economics in your community. I'm okay with that. I'm a compassionate person, but I'm also okay with business leaders driving solutions that help people because they make economic sense. Jacob, I'm going to skip ahead to a slide that I want to show you because you remember the power of this slide here. Our study, the cost study. We did a cost study led by the Chamber of Commerce and the Central Florida Commission on Homelessness, where we looked at the cost of one of these, not homeless people in general, but a chronic homeless person. And what did we find, Jacob? We found that it was $36,000 roughly to arrest someone, that cycle, to send them up and down the mental health system, and they're still homeless. But if we could house them in permanent supportive housing, it was roughly half that cost. I think that was also a big difference.
A big break. This research started, many of you will have read this book, $1 Million Murray. What we discovered was that the law enforcement and the judicial system and the incarceration, all those kinds of things really were focused on a pretty small percentage of the people homeless. So we began to count the dollars, and the dollars became astronomical. And so then the alternative was to get them off the street. Actually was a business play. It was a better investment to move with permanent supportive housing than to leave people on the streets. And just to be in, as you've said, this endless cycle of in the courts, in the jail, on the street, in the courts, in the jail, on the street. That's not going to work now. And I think now 3 or 4 years in, America is agreeing to that.
Yep, this is a report. We'll send you this report and a couple of the reports that we're referring to here. But here, guys, here's business leaders out there. Here's what's important. All that we're talking about right now, this didn't happen with just government.
Right.
Government was working on this for years. Government has to have a great involvement on homelessness, especially from a funding standpoint. I'll show you that in a minute. But what Central Florida under Jacob and others' leadership saw is that the business community had to drive much of the data, the reporting, and much of the education of leadership didn't happen without the business community. And it was a total policy change that led to a sea change in results. Jacob, I'll show you this. We were looking at what cities in America at that time. This is 2013.
Right.
Who were having success? What communities were having success, and who were struggling? You saw, and I saw permanent supportive housing.
Right.
We went to all the cities that were doing well, and we understood that for chronic homelessness, we used to have this idea that we would take these folks and put them into shelters and try to get them clean and sober. Those are all noble things. But we found out that for the chronically homeless with disabilities, we had to take them from the streets and help them. That's a tough sell.
It was a tough sell. It'll be a tough sell for many of the people listening to us today. To stand up in front of people who are in desperate need and to say that, in fact, what we're going to do is to take the worst of these and put them in permanent supportive housing.
Pay their rent for life.
Pay their rent. Okay. We can improve the language, but the results were the same. In other words, what we had to do, and much of these services that we provide today, presumes, let's say you're an alcoholic, it says you dry out and then we'll take care of you. Well, okay, we've tried that for 50 years. It has not worked. So we simply, as a country and as a community, went in a different direction. We said we'll provide supportive housing, and now we'll begin to add the wraparound services. And that has been a huge difference in how we approach this problem. But it was not easy. I don't want to mislead those that are watching. When you stand up, I'm pretty conservative, maybe to some of you, but when I stood up and said, look, we've got to have 1,000 units permanently provided for those people in need at our cost, it was not normally welcomed with a great applause. All right? So that's what you have to begin to teach. This is the right business move, and you've hinted at it now, Andre, and this is also the right thing for the values of our communities and our country.
Let me tell you what was applauded, though, and that was the result. This is from the Orlando Sentinel, which, fake news. Am I allowed to do fake news jokes on a business webinar?
No.
So, all right, so no, okay. So Jacob is my personal publicist, so he tries to keep me out of trouble. But this is not fake news. This is real. Orlando, Central Florida, Jacob. The results of the business community working together with government and other advocates, the faith community, Central Florida was able to reduce homelessness in 3 to 4 years, roughly 50% street homelessness, after being ranked one of the worst in America. And so the results, business community coming back full circle to this point, I want to make it clear, make it again. What was the difference between this drop in homelessness and where we were previously, where we were ranked terribly low in effectiveness? I will tell you, the business community getting educated and driving policy changes. Business leaders, listen. You do this on everything else.
Yeah.
Tourism, transportation, economic development.
Right.
This is the existence of chambers and economic partnerships and is kind of predicated on the fact that business leaders need to organize themselves to drive changes and policy.
Right.
But often business leaders don't do that on homelessness, but here it was a big difference.
And where other cities are making a difference, business leaders are engaged. And everybody that's listening to us right now knows how to do this, whether it's a bond issue, improving educational achievement, whether we're for a bond issue or against a bond issue. You heard Andre talk about momentum. We know how to build it. We know how to galvanize support. We know how to do those things, but we just historically haven't done them with homelessness. We've kind of sat back, and I'm not fussing. I was part of the sitting back, and we sat back and we said, well, that's somebody else's job. Well, here's the new. Economic prosperity is everybody's job. And so therefore now we find ourselves in new areas of service to our communities, all of our communities, and therefore in service to our country. So that's part of what's going on now, this shift of economic leaders speaking to prosperity. And you cannot have a prosperous community when you have hundreds, in some cases thousands of people living on the streets.
Just know this, we're going to send you these slides, but backing up a quick second, there's all kinds of money being spent in your community. Congress has appropriated millions of dollars for your community. Do you know that? Do you know where that money is spent? Do you know kind of the maze of partners in your community? I always ask Jacob, does the business community know who's in charge of homelessness? If there's a problem, do you even know where to look to organize to fix that problem? These are things that the business community, again, has to know. Quick poll question. Madison's going to get mad at us if we don't ask the poll question, Jacob. But right now, there's a poll where we want to know what's the biggest challenge facing your community as a business leader from your perspective. Is it chronic homelessness that you heard Jacob just describe, panhandling, encampments, homeless crime, a crime associated with homelessness, all the above or other? So go ahead and take a minute and fill out the poll question. There's so many of you on this webinar. We'd love to get your feedback. So again, most important starting point, Jacob, business leaders, if they want to help solve homelessness, they got to get educated.
Right.
Just, let me be redundant, just like you get educated on tourism, transportation, economic development, bond issues, the environment, everything you want to impact, you got to engage from an educational and implementation standpoint. That's what we have to do on homelessness. Jacob, I'm going to fast forward a little bit and talk again about the chat box. If you have a question, please go ahead and ask that question now. We had a couple questions come in, and I'll let you answer this with me. Beth Moisky, Denver, hopefully I pronounced that properly, Vice President, Special Districts Downtown Denver Partnership, looking for a best practice to educate the public to choose to give money to organizations instead of panhandlers. We're going to get into that in a second. It was a very important thing for our community's business leaders to be out front talking about the issue. We had, I dug this up. This is an actual mock-up of a billboard that went out through Clear Channel in our community. Business leaders leading on the messaging here. How important is it for business leaders to speak and educate?
No, it's huge. And by the way, Denver is a fabulous city. I love it. But look, here's what happened. It was a media campaign. It was billboards. It was radio, it was television, it was social networks. We engaged the community. In fact, we had a video that went viral, and how many we had?
Millions.
Okay, so and it began to make or give us traction that we were doing the right thing. We were doing the right thing, and people began to say, "Hey, yeah, there needs to be a new solution." And it was Rethink. Our campaign you get the credit for it, of course, but it was Rethink Homelessness. In other words, what you think is not true, let's think again about it. And it took a what we would call a traditional marketing campaign, and it was fabulous. I mean, it made a difference because you saw business people up on billboards, on social media, on television, on the radio, talking about how we were going to work together to solve this dilemma or work at this dilemma, and it made a difference.
Jacob, you said something a minute ago that I thought was fascinating, though. You were like, chamber presidents, you know what to do here. Like if you're right now, if a community was trying to push a transportation tax, right? What would they do? Would they just sit in back rooms, or would they and talk to each other, or would they engage the community in an aggressive radio, social media, television? Business leaders, I promise you, if I have one piece of advice on this whole webinar, It's stop listening to good intentioned people who are providers of help to homeless people who tell you to not do what you always do in your community on an issue. You need to engage and educate yourself and get involved in the same way you do with these other issues, and you can make an absolute difference.
Yeah, listen, here's where I'm not saying this is true in Denver or in other great cities that are represented here. But when we started this, we would go to the providers and they would say, "Hey, well, look, we're glad you're here, Jake. Just get us more money." And we, no. I will tell you now on this issue, it's not more money in the same way. It's new ways, and in some situations, it's less money.
Jacob, real quick.
Yeah.
Interesting. The only solution that we were really given, the business community was given by the providers and the quasi-governmental types, which are my friends, I love them. It was not get educated and get involved. It was simply more money.
We needed a new tax. And the reality is that may be true, but before you go to new revenues, we ought to go to new ways to solve problems. And that's what happened here in Central Florida. It's happening in other places across America. Andre's doing consulting work in other cities where we're seeing great success. And I encourage you just to look at the old problems and maybe approach it with a new attitude. And because look, Chambers, look, this many of you have read the book, Miracles on Main Street. You are the miracle makers.
Correct.
And you can make a difference. And if you stand down and allow others to do it, we will, not in all cases, but in many cases, it'll be exactly the same way in a year. So when business comes to the table, civic leaders, and by the way, we haven't mentioned yet, faith community has a very definite role. And the best way to reach them is through the business community, because leaders of faith are also leaders in the business community. And we need to find a way to get our arms around that. And that's a new civic model that everybody listening right now knows how to do.
Jacob, I don't want to, I'm going to move on to our panhandling portion in just a second. I want to show you specifically some things you should know about panhandling. But the poll question came back. 60% of the respondents say all the above. They're struggling with all those issues. Business leaders struggling with both panhandling, homeless crime, homelessness, chronic homelessness. Not surprising. But when it comes to money, spending money on homelessness, I'm going to fast forward just a second because I want you to see something. These communities right here, Jacob, these communities right here on this list, some of which are on this webinar, do you know these tents, the homeless issue that is just a tragedy in some of our biggest communities in America, do you know what these communities also have in common?
Oh.
That they spend the most money.
Yeah.
Guys, Los Angeles, and I know the Los Angeles people, we're in a private conversation here, just so you know, the media's not on this. It's just us chamber people and myself talking. Los Angeles spends upward of $1 billion a year on homelessness a year. The budget is $574 million just inside of the county and the continuum of care. And they're struggling. I know they've got unique issues at times, but Jacob, here is what the fact is. I know LA is on here. Business community leaders, you're on here. LA, I love you. I'm going to be in LA this Friday meeting with some folks on a different issue. But I would tell you this, that it's, if you look at the communities, it's not the money spent that is the baseline. It's the money combined with accountability and leadership that brings, I know that can even sound in our new environment where everything's political, but what works in our communities without accountability?
Nothing. And you've hinted at it, but let me just put a different phrase on it, that you have to engage the independent sector. Well, that's us. That's the civic part of problem solving. You have to engage the public sector, and you have to engage the private sector that we represent, but we are still in the civic or the independent sector. When you put those three sectors together and they align, you move forward. Any one of the sectors can hold back the momentum of a community. So when they are in alignment, then success is around the corner. Now, who can do that better than anybody else? Business leaders. You understand the importance of government. You understand the importance of the civic community, and you understand the importance, too, of the private sector. Our yield has to be to shareholder value, right, on the private sector. On the public sector, it's quality of life. And squeezed in between there, which stands up, is the civic sector. And that's what we represent. And when the civic sector comes with the support of the public and private, oh my gosh, then things happen. At least, let me speak, that's what happened here. That's what happened here.
It's not only what happened in Orlando, Florida, but if you study, and there's a report, again, we're going to send you, if you study the best practices and the civic engagement that happened in the communities that have seen real transformation, it's behind the scenes. You got to have housing first. You got to be doing the right things. But behind the scenes, it wasn't just money. It was the business community and the faith community civically driving new solutions and accountability. So for some of you out there, I just want to encourage you as I move on to the panhandling piece. You cannot punt this ball as a business community leader down the road, and you can't just be involved in an ancillary way. The Central Florida Partnership, the chamber that Jacob led, it was absolutely helping lead this issue and with government, and that's where results came. Let me dive into, for a second, the second focus area, which is understanding as a business leader. Number one, you got to get educated. Get educated, and you got to get yourself a seat at a table. Even if you got to invent a new table, you got to have a seat at that table and be educated at it. But number two, you got to understand the differences, Jacob, and this has changed over the past decade. The differences between just homelessness and now panhandling, encampments. Things have gotten a lot more complicated. This is actually a photo of Jacob's hometown, Orlando, Florida. And what we're talking about, Jacob, is now business leaders, you're familiar with this, you're now involved in public space management. It's new vocabulary where we're looking at our public spaces and saying, planning, economic development, cultural development, tourism, public space, maintenance, transportation, and infrastructure. This is something we know as business leaders we have to be looking at. But now, again, homelessness, front and center, and not only people who are homeless, but now in greater and greater numbers, people living on the streets and the legalities behind that. And we want to take just a second to talk about that. Because, Jacob, there's some competing views out here. This is incredibly important. This is incredibly important, business leaders. I'm going to give a lot of my opinions right now. If you have different opinions, I respect that. But I just want you to realize that one thing that's really different today versus 10 years ago is really a fight that's happening in our court system and in our communities around America, where some people look at these tent cities, and Jacob, they're not only okay with it, but in some way they are comfortable with this solution.
They want to expand it. In other words, you raised the question, what's different today, particularly when it comes to panhandling, encampments, public spaces? Well, what's different is how the courts have applied the law. And we're seeing advocates that are in favor of these ways of problem solving. Well, that's not how we want to do it in Central Florida. So going back to being educated, you have to be educated on the law. You have to know about the ordinances in your community. You have to know how state law impacts those ordinances. What are the rights of the landowner on trespassing? What about vagrancy? What about those? You have to know these things because your instincts, your instincts are not going to work because the courts will rule, and they have ruled, they consistently rule that cities, communities have an obligation to care for our neighbors in need. And by the way, it's in our hearts. We agree to that. How we get to that place is very different. So I think, going back to your educating business leaders, you have to know the law, and you have to be able to drive public policy to change the law, to bring into conformity solutions that will work for your community.
Jacob, we had this webinar, we had over 100 chamber presidents around America reach out to us, and many of those participating today. We did a webinar for law enforcement on this topic 2 weeks ago. We had 450 communities respond to that. Sheriffs, chiefs of police, desperate to hear ideas on panhandling and encampments. Business leaders, I'm just telling you, this is different than it was a decade ago. And let me take just a minute. I promise you, I'm going to throw 8 hours worth of information at you in 8 minutes, but don't worry about that. We're going to send you all this information. We just want to get your head around things you need to start learning about. So this is, I have pulled this slide and a few slides I'm about to show you off a public website. This is a group called the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty. I have nothing against this group, and I want you to see I think it's fair to show a competing opinion.
Right.
This is a group of people.
I would say competing ideology.
Competing ideology, where these folks are, they were the keynote. Eric Tars. By the way, nice people. But this is a presentation they gave and give all around America right now about the idea of encampments are everywhere, and ultimately what we have to look at is preserving these encampments. We need. They say that 3/4 of encampments are under constant threat of eviction, Jacob. They're constantly being threatened of being removed. This is this is the most important starting point for business leaders and others to just know and understand. There is a constitutional war right now for the legalities of folks living in public spaces. This group here would say that the Eighth Amendment would give people the right to live on the streets, if not for other alternatives, and that's where it gets really gray. What is one person's alternative compared to another? But I would tell you, and this is a gentleman quoting the UN, that people they should be allowed to live in public spaces. That's what this group. And by the way, again, I respect their right to have their opinion. I would say, though, this is where I disagree with them, Jacob, and this is important. They're saying that the Constitution demands that their way be accepted. But watch this, Jacob. This is what my point is. I'm telling you, if you live in a community and you decide with your leaders that you want to let people live all over your streets, put up tents, sleep on sidewalks, all of these things, you do have the right to do that. But that doesn't mean the Constitution mandates that you have to do that. And this is where we would tell you, you need to know federal case law. I'm not going to dive deep into this, but I would just tell you there are really 4 or 5 key cases. Schimberg versus Citizens in 1980, and then look at these dates, Jacob. Yeah, 2015, Thayer versus Worcester, Reed versus Town of Gilbert, City of Tampa, and these are cases that have shaped panhandling, solicitation, encampments, etc. But this is the big one, and this is the one that you should know about. Martin versus Boise, which is a case which was last year, where this is now headed to the Supreme Court, where the Ninth Circuit said that the city of Boise could not stop someone from living on the streets because there wasn't legitimate alternatives, and that's where it got really gray and murky. But I would tell you, there are many of you business leaders, hear this, there are many law enforcement leaders, mayors, county leaders who believe that this now mandates that people have to be allowed to live on the streets. Jacob, it's not true. So, this whole conversation's critically important.
And by the way, if you go to the website that Andre directed you to, they've already targeted cities they're coming to test. So you may want to look and see if your city is on there. What it raises in Florida, and I can't speak to your state, but in our state, the issue is home rule. Who makes the rules? And does a community have the right to make the wrong decision? Well, I think we all agree to that. But we also have the right to make the right decision. And so we need to identify the barriers to doing that, and that requires new leadership. That's all I'm saying. And you have to be knowledgeable about these things. You cannot, I said it before, you just can't go on instinct. You can't say, well, that's illogical. Here in Central Florida, we have a fabulous publicly supported library system. Now look, poor people, homeless people, they have a right to read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. They have a right to go into that library, but they don't have a right to take it over. And now becomes the debate of public space. So it's public buildings, it's public access, it's public sidewalks, it's public streets, it's public parks, and this is what Andre is hinting at. It's this ideological conflict now that's coming across America. And we, all of us who love our country and love our communities have to be armed with the facts.
And by the way, again, Jacob, I want to stress this. I'm not saying I presume to know what's right for you in your community. That would be presumptuous, and I'm sincerely telling you, you have the right as business leaders, as elected leaders out there in your community, law enforcement, you get to create your own local ordinances. But I'm struggling with this conversation in America where people are looking to demand of your community the removal of all legalities around public space. And these court cases, Jacob, business leaders need to know them and need to be able to help mayors, need to be able to help county leaders, law enforcement, shape, chamber leaders, listen to this and listen to it well. This is a new part of your agenda now, in my opinion. And that didn't really exist 10 years ago. You've always had to deal with transportation issues and economic development and all these issues as a annual part of your work. Now, the public space legalities are something you must engage on. And if you don't, this is not anything more than a fact that I want to show again. This is the future, Jacob. This is not a threat. This is not hyperbole. This is the future without business leaders and probably law enforcement partnered with them to make a clear policy shift in your community. Yeah. It's community by community.
It is true. And by the way, you cannot let the judiciary escape. One of the things we're talking about here in Central Florida is a homeless court, or a way by which we have special judges and special protocols and special legal proceedings to really better serve our family of communities. That's an important thing for us, we think, but that requires the legislature to be engaged, that requires the judicial circuit to be engaged, and it requires the judges to be engaged. That's a very different strategy than we used to have, right?
Yep.
So it's important, back to Andre's admonition, is you really have to do the research. And this is an important part now of the research.
I'd be remiss before we move into the final part of the webinar, and thank you again so much for joining us today. By the way, if you have questions, we have the chat box, or you can email us at info@rethinkinghomelessness.org. But I'd be remiss to not say to all you business leaders watching, I might have some of you riled up right now, I'd be remiss to not tell you that Jacob's not in favor of throwing people in jail and criminalizing the homeless. Like, we have spent years in this community, Jacob has spent years in Central Florida, getting help, using resources to house people. This is about compassion. We're just saying, for some advocates out there, Jacob, this is not about compassion. It's about an ideology that wants to remove all constraint in public spaces. And we're telling you, business leader, you better learn about this and stand up, or not making a choice sometimes is a choice.
Let me say that Andre knows America about this issue much better than I. And he, by traveling and talking to people that are listening to us right now, these individual data points really kind of come together to make a major tapestry for our country. And that's what he's speaking to now. So I always say, I can't change the world. I can't change this country. I can only change my part of the world and my part of the country. But if all of us do that, then we can have dramatic impact on the quality of life in all of our communities. And I think that is what we're called to do, right? It is to drive up quality of life and the sharing of prosperity. And this now is a component of our success.
Yep. A couple other questions I'm going to answer, and then we're going to close this webinar in just a minute with a little bit of look at the panhandling study they're getting a sneak preview of it. You know, it's not released publicly until late December. But Vern K from Yakima, Washington, I found CEO, President, Greater Yakima Chamber of Commerce. I found homelessness as government funding is a little bit of a challenge, and it seems like it's not spent well. I'm paraphrasing what she put here. She put something more colorful than that, which I use those same words. But I would say this, Jacob, I agree with this. I know some of this, again, sounds like my own ideology, but I think government struggles on many issues without the private sector, the independent sector's involvement. I think homelessness is one. If if someone out there thinks we're going to give government enough money and they're going to solve this,
Yeah.
is that realistic?
It's not going to happen. And by the way, I have found in my travels with Andre, particularly around Central Florida, that the elected leaders welcome you to the table.
They're excited because they're tired of doing this by themselves.
They know that public sector cannot fix this alone. It's civic, public, and private. It really is.
A friend of yours, Michael Williams, director of Florida Prosperity Initiative for the Florida Chamber Foundation. How can we balance the short-term goals of addressing panhandling with the long-term strategies that move people out of homelessness? Michael, this is a great question. I would just say this. You hit it on the head with your question, which is you got to balance it because there are forces at work that would look to unbalance those scales. Hey, guys, I want to tell you this. I know I'll be in Los Angeles later this week. I know the people in Portland, the people in Seattle. I was in San Francisco 2 weeks ago. I've done work in Fort Lauderdale. Here's the tough part, Michael. No matter what you do as a community to do housing first and to help people get into shelter and all these wonderful investments that are compassionate, if you let your streets look like this, all people will see is the failure that happens on your public space, and it will undo public policy.
Well, let me just say this because I know you've got to get to the other thing. Look, the Florida Chamber is really leading America in many ways in this conversation. But here's what happens, because Andre and I together or individually, like you, have done hundreds of public hearings. And what happens is you start on this, and then somebody stands up and says, well, the issue is about prosperity. It's wage gap. It's achievement gap. And all of a sudden now you're off on another whole direction, which is important. But also this is important. That homelessness and chronic homelessness and people with drug addictions and mental disabilities and physical disabilities, they too need a champion. And so this is a way by which I think we can champion individuals and in the process champion the entire community. Now, the homeless stuff that you're going to roll, the chronic panhandling stuff, we can't find any research in America on chronic panhandling, and so this is important. We just saw it here. It's embargoed until next month. But Andre, I think you ought to share it. I think it's powerful.
So I've skipped around here, but let me tell you that in the last few minutes, I want to talk to you about work we've done now. On panhandling, chronic panhandling. This is a study, Rethinking Panhandling. Here's the idea. We had so many people, Jacob, in your hometown of Orlando, Florida, who had seen a lot of money spent on homelessness and a lot of supposed results. But there were still those who were panhandling, so there were these lingering questions, and we had no data. We had no research.
No data.
So we went in, and in the downtown corridor, we studied who is panhandling. We studied why they're panhandling. This was a year-long study. And we found those who were panhandling more than others, their frequency and intensity, right in downtown Orlando. Jacob, we actually took the CRA because we wanted to have a boundary that we could have integrity. We took the CRA and we looked at every homeless person in it and came up with some really amazing results. And you're going to be the first to hear about those right now. Here's the first thing I will tell you that our study found. Our study identified, and this will never be made public, we're just showing it to a few of the folks on this webinar, 67 panhandlers, Jacob, that were what we called chronic panhandlers, whose panhandling looked nothing like other homeless people who were also panhandling. So we found out of the hundreds and hundreds of people who were homeless in this particular community, Orlando, Florida, that there were a cohort of roughly 60 that their panhandling was dramatic compared to others. When we dived into that group, we're going to send you this. We're going to send you the whole report when it comes out in 2.5 weeks. We found some amazing, amazing causality. One thing interesting, Jacob, very few veterans. The initiative on veterans homelessness that was done really bipartisan, doing supportive housing for chronic homeless vets. Veterans were the majority of those homeless in many of the communities in America. They were roughly 30 to 40% of any of the chronic homeless in America. We only found 3 out of 65 who were veterans, which shows on par that veterans are getting help in America. So that was absolutely fascinating. But let me dive into the most important aspects of this, and we kind of put it on one slide. So, people are panhandling. They're out on the streets talking to those that are trying to do business or working in downtown. We identified that almost all of those who were panhandling, Jacob, chronic panhandlers,
Right.
fall into these three categories and convene right here. They are folks who were truly homeless. So, business leaders, I want to tell you this. This surprised me. We thought we would find, the professional panhandler,
Right, we did.
the person who's like drives up in their car, parks it a mile away, puts on their dirty clothes, and goes and panhandles. Zero.
Right.
Zero professional panhandlers in the CRA who were chronic.
Right.
Does that happen at times? Sure, it happens. But the ones who were chronic were actually homeless. But there were people who were homeless that don't chronically panhandle.
Right.
So what we found though is they were homeless, they have mental illness,
Right.
profound mental illness, and they're panhandling almost exclusively because of a drug or alcohol addiction issue. And so that data, as we bring it to market in this particular community, by the way, I would tell you, you can say, oh, that's going to be different in my community. I promise you, in any big city or a place where homeless people congregate in a city setting, it will be similar.
Right. I think it will.
And so, Jacob, what we saw is that if you want to solve panhandling
Right.
in Orlando,
Right.
one or in other communities, you can't arrest these people away.
Right.
You're going to have to look at them through the eyes of their mental illness and addiction, and most likely have to use supportive housing.
And I think what happens is, that going back to the public campaign, because we've just talked about this, that we have to communicate to our citizens not to hand these folks a $5 bill or a $1 bill.
Nope.
I know for a minute it makes you feel good. And by the way, look, I have a soft heart, contrary to what you may be thinking right now. But when I'm on the street with my granddaughter, particularly, and I see a homeless person getting ready to panhandle, I'll scoot to the other side of the street because I do not want a little 6-year-old girl to see me not help someone in need. But what I'm doing is helping them, because by handing this person a $5 bill or a $10 bill, I feel better. I do. But nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. And so we need a public campaign in our community. I can't speak to others. We've got to tighten this up and tell people to walk on by. And I know it's hard to do, but this is now new data, and we need to respond to new information.
We're going to send this to all of you. There's all kinds of findings, about 70 pages long, best practices, but now data that can help reduce panhandling in a community. I would just tell you this. If 70% of the panhandling is done by a small group of people, what would panhandling look like if you were able to get those folks to a different place? So where do you, in the last 5 minutes, Jacob, where does a business leader go from here? If you have any other questions, please submit them. But I would just say this. The final thing we'd say to you is business leaders and advocates have to work together. You got to get involved. You have to get a seat at the table. My recommendation is that you create your own table by bringing together, Jacob, as you are the master at this, taking all the incredibly important parts of a community, but business drives together philanthropy, the Central Florida Foundation, your friend Mark Brewer, greatly involved, criminal justice, faith, healthcare, nonprofits. The business community has to be the driver. We would love to help you in your community pull folks together and drive a new agenda, a new conversation. You remember this mess here, this eye chart that no one can understand on homelessness that exists in your community? It will never fix itself. This is what we suggest. You got to take this concept and throw it in the middle of a new way that your community looks at strategy, funding, accountability, and how you spend money, and suddenly you will see different results with the same folks in some of the bigger cities on this webinar. Listen, it's not that you're necessarily, this is the hardest part.
Right.
If you bring all your providers and government leaders in and say, show me what you're spending money on, show me your plan, they've got the right idea. They just can't do it without accountability, right?
I agree.
So you need to come together and build a civic infrastructure to help your community. And this is it. This is the whole game. Align business leaders around homelessness. put together a civic, there's communities right now talking to us, Jacob, they're going to put together a civic engagement strategy on homelessness. And so they're align your business leaders on homelessness and homelessness alone. Maybe it's for 12 months.
Right.
Maybe it's 24 months. Maybe it's temporary. But align them together. Increase education and awareness among business leaders. Facilitate new resources when needed. Start with looking at what you're spending money on already and encourage new strategies. Bring accountability and find solutions. Business leaders can do this better than anyone. Madison's going to bother me until I say this. We're going to send you all kinds of information on how we can partner with you. Jacob and I would love to talk to you about partnering with you on how we can talk to your community. Again, I'll be in some of these communities over the next few weeks. Love to chat with you. We do these webinars at no cost. If you have questions, we'd love to talk to you. There's no cost, but we'd love to partner with you and help you get to where you're going on homelessness. We have a 2-day intensive. We have a 90 to 120-day assessment. Jacob, we go into their community. We're objective, and we say, here's what needs to happen. We have different ways we want to help you, so we'll get more information to you on that. I'd be remiss to not close by putting just these last 2 slides up. This is a gentleman by the name of Nehemiah Woody. He was in that video, Cardboard Stories, that you talked about that went viral. Jacob, when you began the work of homelessness with others in Central Florida in 2013, 2014, Orlando was struggling, and it wasn't just panhandling, it wasn't just encampments, it was people dying on your streets. Right. And I remember one of the turning points in homelessness work in Orlando was this young man was one of 13 people that died on the streets of Central Florida. And we, in one of the first business convenings that we did, the mayor of Orlando, along with you and the Reverend David Swanson, the faith leader, we got up, and instead of hiding his story, instead of sweeping it under the carpet, the mayor, other leaders got up, and we read every person's name that died, and we said, the mayor of Orlando said, I failed this person, and me and my leaders aren't going to fail them anymore. And so that accountability, that civic fabric that began to be woven on homelessness, I know, again, that sounds philosophical, but the business community and the faith community drove not just the ideas, but the heart. Right. You said this best years ago with a value study you did. The real question in communities is often not what to do, but who are we, and what are our responsibilities? Business leaders can help lead that. This is the Stat Man. The Stat Man is a young a friend of the community who we helped get into housing, and he had found himself in a homeless position. He was at a place where he couldn't support himself. He's now chronically homeless, but he now is in an apartment and still supporting the local basketball team, and he is only alive today because of strategies that identified that he was someone that needed not a handout, but a hand up, and that's the big difference. And so, Jacob, it's the heart ultimately and the accountability to who we are that's the final thing I think we should leave with the business leaders. Give the business leaders your friends out there, one last piece of advice.
Here's what I would say is, if government had all the money in the world, if they did, they do not have the heart. And the business community brings the heart to the resources. And when that happens, then I think we see real change. So good luck. Have a great holiday season. And please contact Andre if you have any questions.
Download the next steps. Download the webinar materials, our partnership programs. Madison, you're going to get to meet her soon via her contacts with you. You can email her, and we're going to send you all these materials. Thank you guys again. It's been wonderful to share this information with you. Business leaders, we'd love to answer any of your questions. Keep doing the work you're doing, and God bless all of you.
Thank you very much.